Have you ever, genuinely felt that your life is actually a secret language?
Oh, that's a profound way to start.
Right. I mean, like your dreams or these totally random chance encounters or even just the really quiet, mundane moments that they are desperately trying to tell you something.
If only you had the right cipher to decode them.
Exactly. Because we just go through our days assuming the material world is all there is? But then occasionally the veil thins.
Yeah, there's this haunting proposition out there that a hidden architecture to the universe actually exists and is constantly whispering to you.
Which is a beautiful and honestly kind of unsettling question for us to tackle today.
It is unsettling, mostly because it challenges our entire modern operating system.
How so?
Well, we're basically conditioned neurobiologically, culturally, to look for loud, obvious signs. We want the burning bushes. We want lightning strikes and, undeniable empirical data.
We want the universe to text us in all caps.
Yeah, yes, exactly. But if you look at the mechanics of deep psychological or spiritual shifts, the profound is almost always really subtle. It bypasses that conscious critical mind entirely.
So it speaks in, what, smaller moments?
Yeah, the universe tends to speak in the language of a misplaced key or like a sudden, inexplicable scent of rain in a completely dry room or a recurring dream of an empty house that just will not leave you alone. The whisper is really the primary medium of the soul.
And that exact whisper is what we are diving into today. Because the acclaimed Mexican poet Pedro Salvador Alley recently argued that this is the core triumph of a forthcoming, unpublished memoir by Claudia Renfro.
Which is just a stunning piece of work.
It really is, and we have been granted an incredibly rare window into this today. We don't just have an exclusive preview of her book, which is called Cuando la luz llama, or When the Light Calls, but we also have this fascinating audio recording.
The behind-the-scenes feedback.
Right. It's this intimate audio of Pedro Salvador Alley giving his unfiltered editorial feedback directly to Claudia Renfro.
And having access to that audio, I mean, it's like being invited into the darkroom to watch a photograph develop in real time.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
You're literally hearing a master poet dissect exactly how spiritual truth is articulated. He doesn't just read her work as a standard memoir. He elevates it. He calls it a biopoetic masterpiece.
Biopoetic, that's a heavy term.
It is. But that prefix, bio, meaning life, is so crucial here. He's identifying this as a spiritual autobiography. It's the literal biology of her soul mapped out in a poetic form.
Which immediately makes me wonder about utility, right? Like, why is reading about someone else's deeply personal, sometimes honestly bizarre, subjective spiritual visions useful to you or me?
Because abstract theology is ultimately a defensive structure.
Wait, a defensive structure?
Yeah, think about it. Human beings as a species, we don't fundamentally learn profound truths through dry philosophical frameworks. We learn through the visceral, lived experiences of other people.
Ah, I see. Because a textbook just engages the brain.
Exactly. A theology textbook engages the intellect, which means it engages the ego. Your intellect immediately wants to debate it. It wants to find the logical flaw and build a fortress against the idea.
Right, you put your guard up.
But when an author like Claudia Renfro writes a spiritual autobiography and just shares her intense vulnerability, her moments of absolute doubt, her terrifying dreams, she completely disarms the reader's intellect.
She's offering her lived experience as a mirror, basically.
Yes, so when you read about her navigating the terrifying landscape of her own subconscious, you aren't debating theology anymore. You're suddenly confronted with your own unacknowledged spiritual life staring right back at you.
It's the difference between, reading a manual on how water flows and actually being shoved into the river.
Perfect analogy.
Oh.
And Pedro is incredibly specific about why Claudia's writing manages to throw the reader into the river so effectively.
Yeah, he really zeroes in on the poetry interspersed throughout the book, right?
He does. He praises its purity and its strength. But the critique that fascinated me the most was about the actual architecture of her poems.
Oh, where he talks about where they end.
Right. He says they start and end exactly where they need to, without any over-explaining. There's no heavy-handed moral tacked onto the end just to make sure the reader got it.
Which is, the most common pitfall in spiritual writing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. There is this desperate urge to justify the mystical experience to the skeptical reader. But Pedro recognizes that justification destroys the poetry.
He tells her something like, because you are unique and unrepeatable, you have to write uniquely and unrepeatably.
Yes. If you experience something transcendent, you can't just package it in a cliché or a tidy moral lesson to make it palatable. The authenticity of the raw experience is the only thing that actually penetrates the reader's defenses.
It strikes me that Pedro is essentially telling her that her poetry is an arrow.
An arrow. I like that.
Yeah, and an arrow doesn't need a neon sign pointing at it, explaining its trajectory, or apologizing for being sharp. It just needs to be sharp and true, and it will hit the target perfectly.
That is exactly it.
But it makes me wonder about the friction in that process. Why is it so excruciatingly difficult to just write simply and directly about profound truths?
Well, it goes back to what we were just discussing about the intellect as a defense mechanism. Complexity is a wonderful hiding place.
Oh, wow. That makes a lot of sense.
Right? If you write really dense, impenetrable spiritual philosophy, you sound authoritative. You sound smart.
You don't sound crazy.
Exactly.
Right.
But to write simply and directly requires you to strip away the ego completely. You are totally exposed.
Yeah.
You have to admit, hey, I had a dream about a butterfly and it changed my entire life, and you risk sounding foolish to the cynical mind.
So Pedro is acting as the ultimate editor here, not just editing her grammar, but editing her ego.
Yes. He's constantly guiding her to strip away the excess and just trust the raw truth of her experience.
And we hear him apply this exact philosophy to the prose itself, down to like the granular level of word choice, to ensure this absolute, unbroken immersion for the reader.
He gives her incredibly grounding, practical advice on that.
Yeah, for instance, he tells her to completely remove the outdated literary trope of directly addressing the dear reader.
Because addressing the reader shatters the liminal space the book creates.
It pulls them out of the trance.
Right. When you say dear reader, you're reminding the person holding the book that they are sitting in a chair, reading a physical object. You pull them out of the river and put them back on the shore.
And he wants the reader fully submerged in Claudia's subconscious.
Completely. And he takes the exact same approach with modern commercialism.
Oh, the Starbucks edit. I loved that part.
It's so funny. In one draft, she apparently mentions the brand name Starbucks to set a scene. And in the audio, Pedro just laughs and tells her to take it out immediately.
Not just to deny them free advertising, right?
No, because it profoundly breaks the aesthetic of a spiritual text. A brand name is a temporal anchor.
It anchors the text in the mundane present.
Exactly. 100 years from now, that brand might not even exist, or its cultural connotation will have completely shifted. Claudia Renfro's message is dealing with eternal archetypes.
So mixing the eternal with a fleeting corporate logo creates this huge dissonance.
It disrupts the biopoetic flow. He is essentially demanding that her vocabulary match the timelessness of her visions.
He even extends this to historical and cultural accuracy, too. He flags her use of the term Sioux, pointing out that it's actually a derogatory term given to the people by their enemies.
Right, it's a relic of discriminatory language.
He advises her to use Dakota instead. It's a brilliant editorial moment because it shows that linguistic purity isn't just about sounding poetic. It's about spiritual integrity.
You cannot build a narrative of universal love on a foundation of unexamined, harmful language.
You really can't. And that pursuit of universal resonance leads directly to Pedro's most passionate mandate in the entire audio recording.
Translation.
Yes. He absolutely insists that Cuando la luz llama must cross borders.
He is deeply moved by the original Spanish, and he reveres the Mexican roots anchoring the text. But he tells Claudia that the human truth she's uncovered is just too vast to be confined to one language.
He specifically says he wants it to reach readers from the United States all the way down to Patagonia.
It's a call for universal access. He recognizes that pain and seeking and the desire for inner light, they don't have a nationality.
The translation to English isn't just some commercial suggestion for him.
No, it's a spiritual imperative. The message is a technology of the soul, and that technology needs to be open source for the entire globe.
I love that. Open source for the globe. So if the language must be pure and the message must be universal, we should probably look at the actual architecture of this technology of the soul.
Where this profound wisdom is actually located.
Exactly. Because in our culture, we are constantly taught to externalize the search for peace. You know, if you want enlightenment, you need to go on a silent retreat, or climb a mountain in the Himalayas, or read 100 ancient texts.
But Claudia Renfro entirely inverts this paradigm. And it starts with a deeply somatic experience at a women's circle in San Diego.
The encounter with the woman named Donna, who leads the circle.
Yes. What's critical here is how Claudia describes the mechanics of this experience. It isn't described as just a pleasant gathering.
No, she describes it as an energetic, almost atmospheric event. Like, she notes a physical sensation of the room actually changing.
She says the air thickened. as if an invisible bell or canopy had descended over them.
And it isn't just a feeling of pressure. It crosses over into this profound sensory cross-wiring. She writes about the unexplainable scent of honey and roses filling the room.
Even though no one was wearing perfume.
Right, and then she physically perceives colors wrapping around the specific emotional states of the women present. Blue light swathing their collective sadness, violet light embracing resentments.
Golden light illuminating their shadows.
Heh.
She is seeing the invisible emotional weight of a room rendered visible.
What exactly is she experiencing there?
What she's experiencing is the energetic manifestation of collective healing. Trauma and grief aren't just abstract ideas. They are stored energetically in the body. And in that safe space, those energies are surfacing.
And within this incredibly dense atmosphere, Claudia receives a communication. She hears a whisper.
But we have to analyze the specific nature of this whisper, because it breaks every rule of traditional patriarchal religious encounters.
Right, it wasn't some booming authoritarian command from the heavens. It wasn't a mandate imposed upon her with a threat of punishment.
Exactly. It was a loving invitation. The voice simply asked, "Do you want to say yes to me?"
She calls this the IDO, L-I-D-O.
Which is fascinating because we usually associate the IDO with a marriage, right? A legal binding to another human being.
But this is a profound yes to her own soul. It's the acceptance of her mission before she even has the vocabulary to articulate what the mission is.
And the most transformative part of that yes is what it requires of her history.
What do you mean?
To say yes to the soul means accepting the entirety of her being, including her trauma. She realizes that her wounds are not stains that disqualify her from spiritual utility.
Wow.
They are, in fact, the exact apertures through which the light will enter. The wound is the mechanism of the awakening.
That reframing changes absolutely everything. If the wound is the aperture, then the body is no longer this flawed vessel you have to transcend.
It becomes the actual site of the divine.
And she has this profound realization in the quiet of the night shortly after this. She's lying there, searching the silence for some external voice to guide her. But instead, she becomes acutely aware of her own heartbeat.
The autonomic nervous system drumming in the dark.
Yes. And with every beat, like this eternal drum, she hears a direct message. Te amo, te amo, te amo. I love you, I love you, I love you.
It completely shatters the idea that you have to go climb a mountain to hear the divine. She realizes her own chest is an altar. Which brings us to the absolute core thesis of Cuando lo luz llama.
The living book. Right. She writes, "The heart is the living book where God writes every day."
This is a radical democratization of spirituality. If the heart is a living book, you don't need an intermediary.
You don't need a guru to translate it for you.
And you don't need a specific geographical location to access the library. The sacred scripture of your life is literally generating a rhythm inside your chest right now.
But I have to play the skeptic for a second, right? Because this is where modern minds really struggle. If the heart is a book, the obvious problem is that it's illiterate.
It doesn't use syntax.
Yeah, it doesn't write in Spanish or English. It's just a muscle-pumping blood.
Well, Pedro Salvador Allais actually addresses the biological reality of the heart in his audio commentary. And he takes this metaphor to an entirely different, almost dizzying level.
Regarding the space between the heartbeats.
Yes. This is perhaps his most brilliant philosophical contribution to her text. He's captivated by the phrase, the living book, and he introduces the biological mechanics of the heartbeat, the systole and the diastole.
Okay, break that down for us.
Systole is the contraction, the violent pumping of the blood, the action. Diastole is the relaxation, the filling of the chamber, the rest. He points out that we are literally born and we die in every single heartbeat.
That's intense.
But the profound insight is what happens in the microsecond between those two states.
Pause.
The pause. In the microscopic void between the contraction and the relaxation of the heart muscle, there is a tiny infinite space of profound emptiness.
Wow.
Pedro posits that this microsecond of silence is where eternity actually resides. If we look at cardiovascular physiology, the heart actually spends significantly more time in the diastole resting phase than it does in the systole, the working phase.
That is an incredible metaphor. We are biologically designed to spend more time in a state of receptive rest than in a state of active labor.
Yet our entire culture demands the exact opposite of us.
We are constantly in systole, constantly contracting, constantly producing.
Precisely. We are constantly forcing the action, which is why we are all so exhausted. Pedro is saying that the living book isn't being written during the loud, active pumping. It is being written in the silent void of the diastole. The soul resides in the rest.
So, if the text is written in the silence, in that void between beats, how does the conscious mind actually read it? Because the logical brain cannot comprehend that kind of silence.
It really can't.
Claudia Renfro solves this by reading her living book through a breathtaking cascade of dreams and symbols.
Because symbols are the only language capable of bypassing the logical mind's defenses. The subconscious cannot argue with logic, so it operates entirely in imagery.
If it gave you an essay on your trauma, your intellect would just critique the essay.
Exactly. But if it gives you a surreal, undeniable image, it forces you to feel rather than think. And the most striking catalyst in the book is the symbol of the red butterfly.
The scene in Cuernavaca is so cinematic. Let's really map out the sensory details here. Claudia is at a Japanese-inspired hotel. It's deep into the night.
Very atmospheric.
The air is heavy with the scent of wet pine, creating this profound stillness. It's that liminal state right on the edge of sleep where reality starts to blur. And suddenly, out of the darkness, a scarlet butterfly appears.
But the mechanics of its appearance are what really matter. It doesn't flutter around the room aimlessly like a trapped insect.
Right, it possesses an unnatural intentionality.
It flies directly to her and lands precisely on the invisible space of her third eye, right in the center of her forehead.
Claudia immediately identifies this not as an insect, but as a seal. It's an activation, like a biological switch being flipped.
Let's unpack the psychology of that specific symbol. Why a butterfly? A butterfly is the universal archetype of metamorphosis, of a creature that must completely liquefy its former self inside a chrysalis to become something capable of flight.
And why red?
Red is the color of liquid fire, of blood, of the root chakra, of primal physical reality. This isn't a gentle, ethereal pastel butterfly of peace. It's a burning, urgent symbol.
The subconscious is utilizing a symbol of total transformation and painting it in the color of immediate physical urgency.
It is an alarm clock. By landing on the third eye, the historical seat of intuition and spiritual sight, it is forcefully opening her capacity to see the unseen.
And what's fascinating is how this opening of the sight is perfectly paired with a parallel physical experience she has later in California.
Yes, the butterfly opens the mind, but the next vision targets the body.
She's in her room, completely awake, and a sphere of light materializes in the darkness. She describes it as being the size of a football.
Just floating suspended.
And then it suddenly plunges with incredible velocity directly into her chest. She says it literally took her breath away, like a physical impact.
This is the necessary convergence of the spiritual mechanics we've been tracking. The butterfly lands on the mind to activate the vision, but vision without courage is just hallucination.
That's a great point.
The sphere of light plunges into the chest to ignite the heart, to grant her the physical fortitude to actually embody what she's about to see. The mind is opened, and the heart is fortified.
It feels exactly like her subconscious is a darkroom. The butterfly and the sphere are the chemical baths, and these incredibly dense spiritual photographs are being developed in the dark before she's ready to look at them in the daylight.
And once that darkroom is activated, the dreams she begins to have are staggering in their scale. They're deeply mythological.
Like the underwater theater.
Yes. She describes a recurring dream of finding an underwater theater outfitted with plush red velvet seats, entirely submerged beneath the ocean. And the crucial detail is that in this submerged world, she can breathe effortlessly.
Which defies every biological law of the waking world.
Exactly. The underwater theater is a brilliant, layered metaphor for the subconscious mind itself. Water universally represents the emotions, the deep, uncharted psychic depths.
The amniotic fluid of the soul.
Beautifully put. And the theater represents a place of rehearsal and observation. She is realizing that the subconscious is the matrix, where our true works are rehearsed long before the curtain ever rises on our conscious waking life.
And the fact that she can breathe underwater without panic signifies a massive psychological integration.
She is no longer drowning in her own emotional depths. She is comfortable sitting in the theater of her own psyche, just observing the play.
And she takes that comfort into another incredible vision. She dreams of a massive wooden cross floating in a turbulent ocean. She's clinging to it.
But there is a sudden cognitive shift in the dream.
Right. She realizes she isn't holding the cross up to keep it from sinking. She realizes the cross is entirely buoyant on its own, and it is what is sustaining her.
That completely upends 1,000 years of theological conditioning. The cross, traditionally, is the ultimate symbol of burdensome martyrdom.
It's an instrument of agonizing sacrifice that you have to carry on your back until it kills you.
But Claudia's subconscious rewrites the archetype. By placing it in the water and making it buoyant, the cross is no longer a symbol of suffering you must bear. It becomes a symbol of structural support, a bridge over the turbulent waters of the psyche.
It transforms sacrifice into sustenance. And all of this symbolic rewriting points toward a larger epical shift that Claudia Renfro calls the time of the rose.
Which is a deeply poetic theme in the book.
She defines this as the era when the feminine energy finally returns to its sacred rightful place in the human operating system. But what I found most compelling is that she doesn't frame this as a defeat of the masculine.
No, she frames it as an emancipation of the masculine. The time of the rose is fundamentally about balancing internal energies, regardless of physical gender.
So what does that look like?
She writes that the future humanity does not require harder, more aggressive men, nor does it require women who have to harden themselves to survive. It requires men who are finally capable of inhabiting their own tenderness, their own deep waters, without shame.
And it requires women who are capable of inhabiting their immense power and authority without guilt. That equilibrium is the time of the rose. But bringing this back to the listener, I have to ask about the friction of belief here. Because when you encounter a red butterfly on your forehead or an underwater theater, the modern rational mind immediately kicks in with its defense mechanisms.
Of course it does.
How does one choose what Claudia calls el asombro que trabaja, the awe that works over mere skepticism? Because it is so easy to wake up, shake your head, and say, well, that was a weird dream about a floating cross, drink your coffee, and completely ignore it.
It is the ultimate crossroads of the spiritual journey. Skepticism is incredibly safe. It's a protective shell for the ego. If you dismiss the dream as a random firing of synapses, you don't have to change your life.
You never look foolish.
Right. But Claudia Renfro actively chooses the awe that works. Awe, by definition, requires you to surrender your assumption that you understand how the universe operates.
But she adds the caveat, that works.
Yes. She doesn't just passively marvel at these visions and float away into the clouds. She puts the awe to work. She records it, she wrestles with it, and she structurally integrates it into her waking reality.
She treats her subconscious not as a random image generator, but as a sacred text requiring serious translation.
She does the work. And because she does the work, the symbols eventually stop being abstract. They stop being butterflies in theaters, and they become highly specific, direct spiritual mandates.
The ambiguity burns away, culminating in this profound, unveiled vision of a divine presence. We have to examine the vision of the Golden Book and the spiritual backbone of Christ.
This represents a massive turning point in Quando la Luz Llama. It moves from the psychological to the undeniably mystical. During a deep state of meditation, Claudia experiences a vision where Jesus appears to her.
But unlike the previous encounters, there are no veils here.
No water, no insects, no elaborate metaphors to decode. He appears with absolute clarity, offering her a physical object, a massive golden book.
She describes the book as being as tall as she is. It's an imposing, undeniable presence. And Jesus tells her that the era of waiting is over, and she must now write in this book.
And the most striking detail to me is that he doesn't dictate what she should write.
No. He simply stands behind her in silent approval as she begins to fill the pages. It's an incredibly validating, empowering dynamic.
It completely dismantles the hierarchical dynamic we usually project onto the divine. He isn't acting as a dictator, he is acting as a guarantor of her own truth.
And this leads to her deeply intimate realization of what she calls my Rabuni. Rabuni translates to my teacher or my master, but it carries a tone of profound personal affection.
She realizes that the divine is not a distant, terrifying monarch sitting on a throne light years away, scrutinizing her flaws.
The divine is an intimate, quiet presence, waiting patiently in the secret room of her own soul, simply waiting to be recognized.
And she writes so beautifully about this secret room. She describes the ability to go into that inner chamber when the external world is screaming and chaotic and just resting at his feet.
A space of total surrender, completely insulated from the anxieties of the ego. Now, this is where Pedro Salvador Alle's audio commentary provides an absolutely crucial editorial intervention.
He zeroes in on this specific vision.
Yeah, he insists that she must not shy away from these deeply theological Catholic roots, which is fascinating because her journey is so eclectic. She explores cosmic spheres, ancestral indigenous rites, numerology, Jungian dream analysis.
A very expansive text. It would be so easy for an editor to say, the Jesus stuff feels too traditional, it clashes with the cosmic vibe, tone it down.
But Pedro does the exact opposite.
He warns her strongly against diluting the presence of Christ just to make the book more palatable to a modern, spiritual, but not religious audience. He tells her that amidst all the cosmic and ancestral exploration, the image and the transmuting energy of Christ remains a pillar.
A spiritual column that holds the architecture of her soul together.
Exactly. And he provides this brilliant cultural context, noting that even the most deeply traditional indigenous shamans in Mexico, curanderos, who work with earth energies and ancient spirits, frequently invoke the spiritual force of Christ in their healings. They don't see a contradiction.
That is the exact tension that makes this book a biopoetic masterpiece. She's talking about cosmic spheres and the ancient navel of the moon, but right in the center of that vast cosmos is this deeply personal, almost comforting presence of Christ.
Standing right behind her.
How does the text actually navigate this blending of Orthodox Christian imagery with such expansive mysticism without letting them clash?
It works entirely. Because Claudia doesn't treat them as competing dogmas fighting for supremacy. She treats them as different dialects of the exact same language of light.
The Golden Book isn't a replacement for the heart as a living book.
No, it's a fractal extension of it. Christ, in her vision, isn't there to enforce a specific institutional religion. He is there to activate and validate her personal truth. Pedro's advice is to boldly own that synthesis, because that unique synthesis is her authentic voice.
If she removed the Christian element, she'd be lying about her biology.
And if she removed the cosmic element, she would be shrinking her soul.
And what's truly remarkable is that this spiritual blending, this synthesis of the ancient and the cosmic, the indigenous and the Christian, is not just an internal psychological process for Claudia Renfro.
It doesn't just happen in her head.
It is geographically anchored. It is explicitly rooted in the very soil, the actual tectonic plates of her homeland. We have to dive into her vision of Mexico as the seed of the future humanity.
This is the moment in the text where the lens expands from the deeply personal to the planetary. Claudia explores the ancient Aztec name for Mexico, Metzlicico.
Which translates conceptually to the navel of the moon.
Right. She begins to perceive Mexico not merely as a modern nation-state with borders and a government, but as a literal, energetic altar, a sacred womb for the entire planet.
She writes with such conviction that the spiritual gaze of the world is looking toward Mexico right now because a completely new human consciousness is germinating in that specific soil.
And to articulate this, she completely reinterprets the central iconic image of the Mexican flag.
The eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent.
If you ask almost anyone, traditionally, that image is interpreted through a binary martial lens. It's seen as a bloody battle, the triumph of good over evil, the sky conquering the dirt.
But through Claudia's biopoetic lens, applying that time of the rose equilibrium to national mythology, the interpretation completely transforms. She argues it isn't a battle at all.
The eagle represents the soaring spirit, height, broad vision, and the conscious mind. The serpent represents the shadow, the primal fear, the heavy, earthbound abyss of the subconscious.
And crucially, the eagle isn't destroying the serpent out of hatred.
No, it is integrating it. It is literally devouring the shadow self in order to transmute that heavy, fearful energy into spiritual fuel for flight.
It represents the ultimate agonizing process of spiritual reconciliation. You cannot fly unless you have integrated your shadow.
It is a stunning Jungian reframe of a national symbol. But we have to look at Pedro's critical feedback on this section, because this is where a great editor really saves a book from itself.
Pedro loves the Mexicanidad. He deeply loves the idea of Mexico as an energetic focal point for the world. But he issues a very stern, necessary warning.
He recognizes the danger of ego masquerading as spiritual insight. He warns her heavily against sounding nationalistic. He tells her, look, this is beautiful, but the Tibetans say the exact same thing about the Himalayas.
The Peruvians say the energetic center is in Machu Picchu. The Argentinians say it's down in Patagonia.
Exactly. He even references a specific book about the cosmic navel that argues these energetic focal points, these chakras of the earth, exist all over the globe, very often clustered near active volcanoes where tectonic friction creates massive energetic fields.
Pedro's advice here is the key to elevating the book from a regional memoir to a global masterpiece. He tells her she must present Mexico's role not as the only center, but as a vital part of a global tapestry.
It's a seed, absolutely.
Oh.
But it's a seed that is blooming for the entire world, not just for itself.
He explicitly says on the audio that if you sound like you're saying we are the owners of the world and the only navel is here, you will instantly lose the reader in Patagonia or the reader in the United States.
It reinforces exactly why he is so demanding about the English translation.
Yeah.
The message must remain fundamentally borderless.
Okay, I am going to play devil's advocate here on behalf of you, the listener. Because if you're listening to this deep dive right now while walking through a gray, rainy street in London, or taking the subway in Tokyo, or sitting in a small town in Canada, why on earth should you care about Mexico being a spiritual center?
Why does the geographic location of Claudia's awakening matter to your life? Because Mexico as a seed is ultimately a universal psychological metaphor that applies to wherever you are standing. Claudia writes extensively that Mexico is a land of impossible, violent contrasts,
Active volcanoes and deep oceans.
intense, crushing pain, and overwhelming, vibrant abundance. Her underlying point is that wherever intense pain and immense abundance are forced to coexist, wherever the high-flying spirit is forced by circumstance to integrate the heavy, terrifying shadow, that is where a new humanity is born.
The physical geography of Mexico is just the macro manifestation of the internal geography of the human soul.
The navel of the moon isn't just a place on a map. The navel is wherever you, the listener, choose to stand and integrate your own eagle and your own serpent. It happens in London, it happens in Tokyo, it happens in your chest.
That perfectly bridges the gap. The macrocosm is the microcosm. The ultimate proof of this global cosmic awakening isn't found in a geopolitical shift. It is proven entirely by how it manifests in the individual's rebirth.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most moving section of our exploration, birthing the inner light.
Throughout the early parts of the book, Claudia Renfro is haunted by recurring, distressing dreams of neglected babies.
She dreams of small, defenseless children left in dark corners, crying, completely forgotten by the adults.
And as she does the work of the awe that works, she eventually realizes that these aren't literal babies, and they aren't even memories of her own childhood.
They are the orphaned neural pathways of her soul. They are the neglected parts of her true self, the pure divine potential she is starved of attention because she was too busy living in the loud external world.
And as she begins to integrate her shadows, to say her IDO, this haunting motif culminates in a truly visceral, powerful dream of labor. She dreams she is on the floor, on the raw earth, physically giving birth in what she recognizes as an ancient ancestral rite.
And the baby she finally births after all this struggle isn't neglected or crying in a corner. It is beautiful, completely clean, and profoundly loved.
She recognizes instantly that this baby is her own pure consciousness.
It is her soul, finally brought out of the underwater theater and birthed into the waking world. It is the absolute somatic resolution of the IDO from the women's circle. She hasn't just accepted her mission, she has finally given birth to the self capable of executing that mission.
And we get to see exactly how this newly birthed consciousness actually affects her physical reality in what might be my favorite anecdote in the entire book, the story of the Forest of the Templars.
It is a stunning example of what happens when the internal biology perfectly aligns with the external universe. Claudia goes for a hike into the woods with two of her close friends, Manolo and Aloe.
They hike up a damp hill, sit down amongst the pine trees to rest, and suddenly the atmosphere shifts exactly like it did in the women's circle.
But this time, they are overwhelmed by a shared, spontaneous memory. Without speaking, they all tap into vivid memories of being apostles, of being ancient Templars. They don't discuss it. They just sit there, enveloped in this profound, heavy silence.
And this is where the physics of the experience break down. Time completely dissolves. For the three of them sitting on that hill, they feel as though they've been sitting in silence for perhaps 15 minutes.
Maybe 20 at the absolute most.
But when they finally break the silence and check the time, 3 entire hours have passed.
We can look at this through the lens of modern psychology as a profound shared flow state, where the default mode network of the brain, the part that constantly tracks time, ego, and anxiety, completely shuts down.
But Claudia explains it through a spiritual physics.
She writes that when the soul is perfectly frictionlessly aligned with the eternal present, time simply ceases to exist. It cannot bind you. It is a literal taste of eternity, of the infinite diastole experienced right here on a damp hill on Earth.
Which leads us directly to the core thesis of Cuando la luz llama. It's a sentence that, when you really let it sink in, stops you completely in your tracks. She writes, "The light does not arrive to show you the way, but to remind you that you always were the way."
It completely flips the entire paradigm of human seeking. Our default setting is that we are broken, lost in a dark forest, desperately hoping a searchlight from heaven finds us and points us toward the exit.
But she is saying there is no searchlight coming because you are the light.
You aren't lost, you've just closed your eyes to your own incandescence. The entire journey of the book, the integration of the serpent, the decoding of the dreams, isn't about acquiring new light. It is entirely about removing the debris so you can remember what you already are.
I keep thinking about the profound vulnerability required in that birth dream. It's actually terrifying to realize that the neglected, abandoned, crying thing in our bad dreams, or the root of our waking anxieties, is actually our own purest self, starving for our attention.
It is terrifying.
So moving from the ethereal to the fiercely practical, what does it actually look like in everyday life for you or me to nurse or care for this newly birthed spiritual consciousness? How do we keep the baby alive?
I think it looks exactly like the methodology Claudia deployed. It means you stop ignoring the quiet symbols. When you have a dream that shakes you, you don't dismiss it, you interrogate it.
You do the work.
It means treating your own physical heart, your own body, with absolute reverence because it is the altar where the book is being written. It means that when you inevitably encounter deep pain or shadow in your life, you don't run to distractions to numb it.
You let the eagle integrate the serpent.
Exactly. And practically, it means consciously choosing the awe that works over the safety of cynical skepticism every single day.
The journey of Cuando la Luz Llama is ultimately a profound act of remembering. It reminds us that despite every message the modern world screams at us, nobody is born fundamentally broken. You are never, even in your darkest underwater theater, truly alone. And the light you are so desperately seeking outside of yourself, in a guru, in a promotion, in an external validation, is already entirely contained inside you, meeting a steady biological rhythm in the living book of your heart. Claudia Renfro, guided by the incredibly sharp, loving editorial wisdom of Pedro Salvador Allais, has drawn us a map of the exact geography of the soul. But a map can't walk the territory for you. We have to take the steps.
It truly is a biopoetic masterpiece, and Pedro was absolutely right. It is a text that belongs to the entire world. Its translation and dissemination will be a gift to anyone brave enough to read it.
I want to ask you, the listener, to do something highly specific today. When you turn this off, find a quiet moment. It doesn't need to be an hour of meditation, just a few seconds. Put your hand on your chest and actually listen to your own heartbeat. Acknowledge the sheer, miraculous persistence of your own inner light.
Just listen to the rhythm.
And I highly, highly recommend you seek out Claudia Renfro's masterpiece, Cuando la Luz Llama. Experience it in its original, beautifully pure Spanish, or keep an eye out for its future English translation, which Pedro so wisely demanded. It is a book that will fundamentally alter how you view the secret language of your own life.
It will teach you how to read yourself.
We will leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on Pedro's brilliant biological insight. If the heart is indeed the living book where God writes every day, what if the silence between your heartbeats, that tiny, infinite pause between the systole and the diastole, that microsecond of rest where your soul actually resides, what if that silence is the blank page? What are you writing in that silence?